So welcome everyone who's joining. Can people hear me? Can people see me? And most importantly, can they see the screen?
Yes, everything okay.
Yes.
Excellent. And I hear voices, so that means we have actual people here. Always nice. Good. In that case, let's proceed. So this is the second event session of Let's Build. Some of the names I do recognize, some of the names are new, but happy to see everyone who could make it. And today we are looking at kind of our first, second topic. So if in the first time we had discussion and kind of presentation about Git, then today our topic is ASP.NET MVC and front-end development. So that's the second topic, and the goal for today is to go through the so-called front-end development. So if you're building a web application, the front-end part is everything that the users will interact with. So the screens, the JavaScripts that kind of make more interactivity possible, and also the server-side code that enables kind of giving this kind of front-end code to the client's browser. So that at least we call front-end. And we will stop kind of at the border where we would need to go and save data, because that's the topic for the next talk. So today mostly I'll be working with static lists, which I will just pre-populate with some data, but will not try to go into the database and save the data or modify the data in any way. So that interactivity will be something that you will yourself will try to build for the next event. Yeah, before we kind of get going, who of you created something already for this event? So how far did you get? Were there any kind of challenges? Any feedback about since the first session?
To me, 2 weeks flew by so fast, and only today I, started to read the materials.
Okay, that happens. What can we learn from this experience? I think the most important thing is to set aside time for learning. Yeah, Yanis?
I can say that I hate frontend, like truly, and had problems with the understanding. That's because that's why I asked some questions in chat. It's not hard to create from template, like change what there is page data in the client side, and except without how injections, same, just lists with little bit adding data service, so it's theoretically can be binded to something else later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, today's focus will be kind of mostly on the front-end side. So what I'll try to do is to show how I would approach when starting an application from scratch. And yeah, so for anyone saying they hate front-end, well, probably haven't worked enough or have had bad experience because of the solution chosen. But that's a fine thing. There are people who are full stack developers. There are people who are front-end developers. Well, they make their own life choices. And there are people who focus mostly on backends and kind of services and that part. And nothing wrong with that. But yeah, kind of with these comments, then let's proceed. So a reminder, and this will be in the presentation in the GitHub after the event as well. So this is where we can find the resources. This is the Discord link if you haven't joined, and I strongly advise everyone to join Discord and to kind of type in the hashtag Let's Build so I know whom to assign to the group. Currently, we are something like I think 14 was the number I counted before we started. So not everyone maybe is able to make to the call, but some people have privately commented that they will be watching the recording. So that's an option as well. But please ask questions. Jan is kind of did the right thing when he kind of encountered some situations. So at least we know what to focus on during the kind of these live coding sessions, and we can prepare a bit better, or maybe even resolve your issues earlier. Okay. Yeah. So the business use case remains the same throughout the whole event. So we are building an application that can help us to organize events, to add people to events, and kind of to allow workers with people, well, with registries. This is what basically it is. It is a registry of people we add to an event. So in a second, we'll jump into the practical drawing, but I think I will start with the next session. So as I already mentioned, we'll go only as far as connecting to the database. But for next session, if you haven't done the front-end version, you can still try to do your own. If you want to kind of proceed, I will share my own solution also on GitHub then after the event, as far as I will get. Or you can pick one of the labs as the basis for your work and start from the kind of earliest lab and build up on top of that. So that's also another option if you, for some reason, don't prefer my code, or if I manage to screw something up along the way and don't have a working app in the very end. So for next section, you need to add ability to store the data in database, no longer in just the application's memory. And you would need to use Entity Framework Core or some other ORM. If you pick something like Hibernate, or, well, even the simpler mappers like Dapper would be interesting choice if you want to explore that. But Entity Framework will be something that we showcase in the next live coding session. So try to build and connect, and if you face any challenges, then please ask the questions in Discord. Yeah, and in the end, you should be storing all the code that you create for the application, and also database structure in the repository, so that it's not only stored in the database instance, but also in the repository. As for the database, you can install it locally. There is certainly versions available which you can use for that. Or if you do have a Azure account, well, for some reason, you can also use their kind of free tier Microsoft SQL database. That's another option. It's just kind of different place where to locate database. If you don't have Azure account, I wouldn't yet ask you to create the Azure account, because that will be a focus specifically for the later sessions that we have. So you can create it only then to kind of take the maximum advantage of the available credits that you get kind of either through trial, or if you're going through the student's access, then what you get from the student's access. So yeah, this is the task for the next event. And with this in mind, we'll proceed to the live coding session. So that is scheduled to take around 1.5 hours. I probably will make a stop around 5 o'clock to have a short break. And after that, after 10 minutes, I think we can then continue. And then after kind of we are done with the live coding part, there will be some time for Q&A. So if you have questions either about the previous task or about the next task, that's the time when to ask the questions and kind of have wider discussion around that. And yeah, if we are done with the questions sooner, then we'll end sooner, because if you still kind of remember questions later on, there's Discord where you can reach out to us and ask them. So that's the plan. Any objections? Good, then we can proceed. Okay. So live coding. And I do apologize if I probably will get something wrong. I will probably get stuck a couple of times with the solution not building. And I will probably look up something on the web because something will work not as I anticipated. But it's live coding and it's live commentary, so you'll get kind of the full experience of watching somebody try to do something. And the reason why we encourage you to do your own solutions beforehand, it's easier to follow along if you have tried to do it yourself. Even though you might have kind of encountered difficulties, it will be easier to follow along if you have already done this yourself. While I'll proceed with coding, I will comment on what I do and some of the kind of more expand of some of the topics which I cannot show kind of in the code because of the time. But you can also try to interact with me and ask questions or just ask to clarify why I do a certain thing. Then again, yeah, so go ahead.
I have questions already. I am new to such sessions, like don't know how it works
Yes.
actually. The idea is we do parallelly what you are doing, or we do it with our codes, like what we do, just look and admire or do something.
Yeah, going in parallel will be hard. And the issue is that with the number of people currently on the call, most likely some of you will get stuck at some point and will need to play catch up until the end. So that's kind of why we encourage people to use the time in between the sessions to try to build their own solutions. And then you can follow along and be more focused on, okay, what is he doing? Why is he doing that? And what is it clear for me? Or do I have questions related to that? Of course, what you do currently, it's up to you. You can try to follow along, as I will be kind of typing everything myself and doing everything myself, so I don't have any kind of prepared code to copy from. So probably I will be at an average pace. Keep in mind, I'm not currently doing development in my daily job because my daily job is mostly meetings with people talking about what people will do development on. So I'm a bit rusty myself, but I think that will allow you to follow along just fine if you choose so. Then again, it's not expected that you kind of write the application at the same pace, because then we would need to kind of stop and stop and stop so everyone can synchronize. That, of course, takes longer time. Does that answer the question?
Yes, completely.
Okay. And regarding the comments, so that can be anything from kind of hinting at something if I get stuck. So that will inevitably happen. Or if you kind of feel that something is uncertain and I'm skipping that part, do ask the question as well, because even if I am not able to immediately answer, it's something we can then kind of follow up easier afterwards because we will have it on the record. Okay. Good. Then let's proceed. So we're building a web application. So this is kind of the way that Visual Studio launches for me. You can disable that pop-up, but for me, it's create a new project. Why not? I'll try to comment, but at some time I might stop speaking when I'm typing more. Speaking and typing is a difficult thing to do. So what do we want to build? The templates are very useful. So if we want to find something more specific, we can use the search. Usually when I want to find what the new templates are after Visual Studio upgrade, I might kind of poke around and look for something. But what we actually want to do is ASP.NET Core web application. We can pick from several kinds of templates, and then we kind of need to look in details what specifically they are. So it might be, sometimes I have myself mixed up and started the project with F#. Well, that's very nice. It kind of looks the same, but you realize the language is not the same. So, yeah.
Not Blazor application.
No, today we will start with just web app. Blazor will be something which we add on top of our web application, but I will not take Blazor as the basis. And the reason is quite simple. I'm myself not that handy with Blazor. So what I've done is a few tutorials, which you also had access to. So that will be something we'll show how it's added on top of MVC application. But the kind of natural use case, of course, would be that you will create it separately because you would either focus on MVC or then focus to have a separate kind of Blazor application where Blazor does all the heavy lifting for rendering the pages. Okay. Core web app. Well, this looks like a good option. So ASP.NET Core Web App Model View Controller. And let's event. How do we call the application? Anyone quick? Event Hub? No. Super event app. Let's make it fun at least.
So project name is always without spaces, right?
Well, it's my preference. Yours might change, but for names at least I tried. Spaces are a funny thing because they work differently in browser, they work differently in operating system, they work differently in the code which we write. So I've gone into habit to kind of just not use spaces when possible when I do naming things which I use for software development. So my first app, that's actually a great name for application. Okay. So version of .NET, usually you want the latest, which is not in beta. So for me, I'll choose Core 3.1. Authentication type, I will not select anything currently. Configure for HTTPS, why not? Because in real world, you want to have HTTPS. We will not use Docker. That kind of would increase the scope of things I need to tell you about. And create. So at this point, it kind of just takes the template from the disk, generates all the files, and the templates are set up to kind of have a basis for the applications. So Microsoft creates them and keeps them up to date. And what they present are shortcuts to setting up your application. You might have your own preferences, so you might invest time in creating your own templates. But my own feeling is that if the industry is going one way and these are good enough templates to start new projects, I'll most likely keep with industry's template and do my own preferential adjustments because they usually aren't that large. Because as soon as you're going against the grain, you will face more difficulties. Okay, so it created some folders, created some files. First thing I usually like to do is immediately launch it. The code that templates generate is buildable and launchable, so it's a good way to validate that you have everything installed, especially if you're on a fresh machine. Nowadays, it's less problematic because .NET kind of gets all its dependencies from kind of they are loaded as nuggets or can loaded from the web. But in the olden days, this was more of a problem because you might have something wrong installed on your machine and well, everything kind of works except it doesn't. So it's building. Visual Studio switched to debug mode, and on my second screen I got a fresh window. So we see it's launching as HTTPS and hosting on some port on localhost. Okay, so debugger kind of connects to the application, starts tracking what it's able to track. It does take some while. I think screen sharing doesn't help the performance of my laptop. Okay, and here we have it. So what we get out of the template is already some styling, already some pages which we can navigate to. Okay, so there's privacy page, home page, and some basic layout. Usually this is something that you will discard, but if you're just doing an experiment, this is fine to keep to kind of not have to rewrite everything from scratch. In your own applications, if you haven't done your part, I would advise to kind of spend some time and actually do the customizations. So now that it's running, I can actually stop it and let's look at what we have. By the way, do you see my screen okay? Is the font size tolerable?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, if it's not comfortable to read things, especially in the Visual Studio, have it open on a second screen if you have one. It's then at least based on the location of the folder, things like that, you can follow along easier. Okay, so what did it do? So we have this www root. So here is all the static content it generated. So let's look quickly through that. So CSS files. So these are the styles for the web page. JavaScript files. Well, currently we just have one, which doesn't do much. Yeah, well, write your JavaScript code. Thank you for that. Libraries. So these are libraries that were preloaded to kind of enable styling. You don't really need to care about that too much. Favicon. So this is the little icon you get on top of the web page. Controllers, models, views. So if you're talking about ASP.NET MVC, MVC stands for models, views, controllers. So these are the main kind of entities through which we operate. And very shortly, the concept and the pattern. I think this is in the documentation as well, so maybe I'm repeating what you already read. Controllers are the ones who are responsible for telling the application, kind of receiving the request from the browser, and then telling different things. Model, go do that. Service, go do that. And then asking the view, okay, generate the HTML and send that back to the browser. So that's the bossy guy who just tells, go do things. Models, they are the ones who contain data. They are the heaviest ones. They may contain their own logic within them to either help them being validated or maybe do some business logic within them. Although that's where to place the business logic, it will very much depend on the size of the application you're creating. And views, here we have then the different view folders for different controllers, and also the shared folder, which kind of is, well, all the things that are used by more than one controller are then located in shared and will be looked up if it's not found in the controller's own view folder. But the views themselves, they represent kind of the HTML code that will be sent back to the browser, except it's not purely HTML. We also have some, they are Razor templates, so they do have some logic code within them, and it's actually executed on the server side before it's sent back to the browser. Okay, then we have some funny CS files, program and startup, very much needed. In the older versions of ASP.NET, I could say that, well, you don't really need to touch them, but the current reality is that setup CS is something where you usually set what kind of things are done in the application or used by the application. So for example, with the kind of preset, we have said that we want to have, we want our application to be redirected to HTTPS when it launches. We want to kind of serve static files. So if the browser is asking us for a JavaScript file or for a CSS file, the application itself will respond, hey, yes, I understand what you're asking me, and I will send you this static file as well. If we remove this, it wouldn't answer to that, so we couldn't load any CSS files from the kind of any of these files wouldn't be loaded. So routing, authorization, endpoints. So this what enables kind of the route that we are using. So the standard one is the name of the controller, name of the action on the controller, and optional parameter ID. So that enables that we can, when we do navigation, that we can navigate to our application URL slash home slash index, and that would navigate to this action. But so much for the theory. So what are we actually trying to create? So if this is an event app, and I'll actually probably open up a new PowerPoint file so I can try to visualize what I'm aiming for, so it's easier to follow along. Okay, just give me a second. So what we tried to create, where are my simple shapes? Ah, here they are. So what we're trying to create is basically one screen will be kind of screen for all the marketing materials for Migrate app. One will be the event registration screen. So if you looked at the labs focus on just having the people list. So here I'm actually expanding it to kind of be more aligned with the business use case. And so that's why I have an event registration screen. And this is the screen where people, where you would kind of go to add people for the event. We are not really kind of making this kind of self registration yet. If I will have time, I will add that. But I would like to have my own management screen so I could enter all the participants, which I would have for the event. And that event registration screen probably will need also a participant list. And what else? Any ideas what I'm missing? Okay, let's then get started with this one and see where we go. So home screen, the controller returns the index action and it will return the index view. So based on the naming, this is the view that it will return. So if I want to do my own modifications, so welcome to what they name my application, super event. And that we don't need. So this will be my nice welcome screen. And views themselves are mostly HTML. Sometimes when I want to do prototyping or just kind of quickly build up the layout, I'll probably play around with the views here. And I might, if I'm in a hurry, I might not do things properly. So I might do inline CSS and things like that. And then once I'm more or less satisfied, remove things out to the static files to the site CSS so that I can have proper styling. In this case, we already have loaded. Let me just check the layout. So yeah, in the layout we already have, and this is something which I probably should zoom in. Nobody's asking for that, but I'm certain you cannot read everything. So we already have some libraries, JavaScript libraries loaded. So what do we have? jQuery, which we'll try to avoid using. The reason for that being that jQuery, while very handy and very useful, adds problems because this jQuery file itself takes some time to load, takes some time to parse, and that time could be spent already doing something else on the browser or already having your page interactive. So with jQuery, it's good to when you're just getting started, but you need to remember that there are other ways how to deal with interactiveness on the web. So my encouragement would be not to stick around with it too much, but Bootstrap itself uses it. So, and Bootstrap is the library that enables us to have nice looking UI out of the box if we don't want to do our own custom CSS and custom style implementation. And it's why we have these different classes then added for any HTML element we have in the application. So just a quick question. So do we have somebody on the call who is not very familiar with HTML? Okay, at least I don't see any hands. So I will not go too much into detail. So how HTML works. Yeah, and I just noticed the comment about user registration screen. So let me just jump to that. So event participant registration screen. So that will be the user registration screen basically. Okay. Home. I was quite satisfied with how it looked like. I don't want to add marketing messages to that just yet. So instead, I want to focus on the event itself. And currently, I will probably not make kind of pages to register multiple events. If I will have time for that, maybe, but not immediately. So I'll focus on the ability to add multiple people to one event. So for that, I don't really want to use the home controller because that will be for my kind of marketing e-message, because that's kind of the first screen that's configured to pop up by default. But let's add specific controller for events. And I could start with just empty controller. Of course, you can use the templates with read and write actions. This speeds up development, but in my case, well, that wouldn't allow me to tell as much, or well, what's the fun in getting auto-generated code? So that's event. So all controllers end with controller. That's the rule. That could be reconfigured, but I can't think of a use case where you actually would need to mess around
Can
with
you
it.
tell which one you chose in the previous step?
Yes, I can still that. So MVC controller empty.
And just an empty, okay.
Yeah, because I want to start from scratch. This second one is also a possibility, and this is even more because it already will generate code to connect to the database, but I don't want to go that far. So for today, it's just an empty controller, and that's event controller. Okay, and that should generate something like this. So with the names of controllers, be careful because they will appear in the URLs that the users get. So if you can name them something funny, don't be surprised that when your marketing guys or your management kind of comes up to you and says, "What the hell is this?" So names matter, and not only because for you to understand what it is, it also matters because they help to build the URLs. Same goes for action names. So index, as in this kind of startup, we have pre-configured routing. So it already sets that action default name is index and default controller is home. So it would automatically go to home index. But if you're going to a different controller, then the default action is index. So in case if our URL will be, I'll just use the comments to describe that. So event slash or just event, it would actually go to index because that's configured to be the default action. But here, event slash index does absolutely the same. If we would just go to this URL, it would actually go to home index because of that configuration I showed. But this is kind of the mapping of routes. If you have questions or this seems unclear, we can touch on that in a moment, but do ask the question then. Okay, so this is event controller and index page. So now we have the controller. We also would like to have probably a model that describes the event. So when we're talking about larger applications, we usually try to avoid having all the business logic inside of the controllers. For smaller applications and use cases, it might be fine, but pretty soon, as long as it's something more like a week where you work on it, you will start to kind of having too much code in the controller. So at that point, we would be defining services, but we'll be adding those in a moment. For now, we'll just kind of set everything up so that we could kind of show this on index. We would show this, how did we name it? Registration screen. And under event, we would also have participant list. So we want to have two screens under the event controller. So this would be, I'll just add the note for myself. And what we also want to have is participant list. So And here the URL would be your application's domain /event/participants. Okay, so these are two screens we will build. For that, model-wise, we will need to describe somehow what is a participant. So for that, we'll just add a class under models. So models are also, they're called kind of POCO classes. So POCO, plain old C# code. So plain old objects, and basically those are just classes which only have properties or fields that describe the data. So they might not have too much of logic within them, or they can have some logic, but kind of these. I prefer to have these models more describing the data instead of doing a lot of things. For that, I usually have service classes, which are further down the line and more, well, interactive. So it's an event that we're doing, and event has participant. So that's the class participant. And now please help me. What are the properties of a participant? So play the business owner and tell me, how do event participants look like when we want to describe them? They probably have a name. Email. Email. Okay.
Age.
What? Age. Let's see how how invasive do we want to get? Public. Well, let's do int age. Approved. How we would use approved?
Like bool.
Boolean. No, but what I mean with the question, for what business purpose? So we would want to have approvals for everyone.
Participants. If it's by default approved, then it's not needed.
I think
If someone like want to participate in something, he fills form like I want to participate.
Okay, I'll add public. Public wishes. So if people want to participate, and as Oyars was adding, 5 favorite Spice Girl, I will not be so specific. I want my application to be more generic so that people can express their wishes in advance. Well, as I was asking in the initial survey, so what are the specific topics you might want to have covered? So let's give that option as well. Not the most variety, but that will do. So we have model for participant.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So this class we are creating in our model, is that like a placeholder for database table where this information is going to be stored, or what is it?
Yeah, it represents a record in the database, but it will not be the record that we save to the database. So it represents, well, that record, but most specifically what we want to show from that. Because in database, we might have additional fields. For example, we might have their, and we will have their ID, which might be GUID or integer, but there will be some identifier which is not one of these. So this is something what we call a view model. So a model we create specifically to show in a view. And while it's very closely linked with the database model, usually it's kind of good practice not to push the whole database model to the front end. Because what happens, and later on when we can look at the form, how it's submitted, what happens is that form submission tries to bind all the values to the model. And if you have some fields which would be called, for example, Boolean is admin, then those, well, even if you don't have them in the form, the way MVC works, if browser sends that field, or if the application receives it from the browser, it tries to map it to the field, even though you maybe didn't show it in the HTML. But somebody malicious might be kind of doing something fishy like that. So overposting is the term used by security experts who nag about this, but it's an actual kind of form of attack that was used at one point to attack GitHub, for example, and to get admin rights for certain repositories. So at least that was something that was exposed at some point. Yeah, and Oyars, you're right on that. So wishes a separate table. Well, wishes we can add for later a separate table. That would be a good exercise, but I'm kind of looking at the clock and understanding that we'll probably not get that far today. And I will have to kind of do some completion before I share my code slightly after the event. So we are on better term in terms of the functionality. So let's limit it to this. And on event controller, so participant registration screen, I don't really need any data for the registration screen. So that's empty screen. So it's fine as it is. For the participant list, I will want to get a list of participants. So I don't have a database to go to. So for me, it's just the list of participants. Of course, I'm lacking using. Misclick. So using super event app.models. So this adds the using. I need to find the model. So it's a list of participants. And as we don't have a database to go to, at least not in today's exercise, I'll just add a couple of participants. Up. So what fields did we have? Name equals Johnny. Age is, well, how old is Johnny? Let's say 25. And email is Johnny at because everyone has Gmail email. Okay, so that would be the data that we get from the service or database at some point, but we want to send that data to the view. We haven't yet created the view, but in the end, it needs to end up on the view and be rendered for the user. So we'll use kind of strongly typed views.
Sorry, what could be the reason that the participant tag for me is not blue and shown like a error?
Yeah,
what
likely
haven't I done?
You are missing using. So you need to tell that this control, which is located in namespace super event app controllers, it doesn't know about this other folder called models. So we need to stay using your application name dot models, so it sees that object. But we can check later about the namespaces. So it is a bit different topic. Okay, so that's a list, and we pass that list to our view. It is one of the ways how we can pass it. Alternatives would be to either use view bag or view data. So view bag is the magical kind of abstract thing where we can name it, name the property anything, but it has no kind of validation for it. So this will work, but if you mistype the listing, then on the other side, on the view, then it's your own fault for not kind of spelling it right on the next side. And that is something that I really don't like. So I try to avoid using view bag and view state as much as possible. Okay, so we send the list to the view. Now let's add the view, because next thing is how the hell will we see the list of participants? So under views, we need a folder which is named the same as our controller. So in our case, it's event. And that folder is just the first place the application will go and look for the view. And there we add a view. So it will give us a pop-up, and we want it to be empty. Blazor view, I think this one will scaffolding. So let's just go with empty one. And we will call it not index, because we will need one for index. Well, maybe let's add index as well. So that's empty. We don't need to touch it yet. But let's add view empty, and let's call it. And I forgot to check how the actual name is. Sorry. So the actual name is participants in plural. Okay. And we want to match the up with the name of the action itself. As long as it matches the name, it will find it automatically. If it doesn't match, then under view, you would need to specify which view name you want to use. So that's certainly possible, but it's simpler when it just kind of automatically finds things. So participants. For participants, we want to tell them that we will have a specific model in place. So that's a list of participant. Okay, it found both namespaces, but just because they are listed here in view imports. So here we can add all the usings that we need so that it can find the namespaces if we have some different folder structure here or some different namespaces. Now that it has kind of this using models, it's basically no problem here for it to find it. Okay, and now under property model, we get the model that was passed from the controller to the view. So in this case, it's a list. So naturally, what I want to do is, how will we render the list? I think it's a good place for a table, right? So it's a table. It will have table header. So it will see their name and email. And age as well. And then for each item in model, so for each item in model, I want to have another table row, but this time with table fields, not table header. And it would be item. It didn't recognize it. So for each participant. Okay, now it got it correctly. Yeah, so var was wider type, and I'm not quite sure why it didn't recognize it, but well, this helped it. So item dot name, item dot email, and at item.age. So this should render the list of participants. And actually, to just validate it for funs and giggles, let's try to launch it. Okay. And it launched on the second window. Let's see. So home screen, we just changed some text and some of the content, so there shouldn't be any surprises there. Okay, the changes are there. Then for events, I had event, the name of the controller, and then index we didn't yet create. Oh, now we actually created the view as well. So we can actually do event and it just loads an empty view. So that's index. So this is basically the same request. But if we do event participant, hey, here's our table. So what this request did was map to the specific controller. Let's see, event controller, found the action named participants. Here we created the static list, filled it with data, which would be the kind of journey, it would go to database and ask for that. And then told to return this object model back, well, not a model, but this specific object back to the view and return the view result. And the view itself was, sorry, yeah, this participants CS.html. So for it, we told that it's a strongly typed view. So it will kind of represent this model as the object it receives. And with that, we were able to do some kind of rendering of the list. And then it's kind of when it's composed all together. So when view renders, it actually takes the kind of partial view, which only represents this table within the overall navigation. And it composes it together with the layout, which does the rest of the page. So kind of the outer shell. And when I imagine about how the views are being rendered, I usually imagine that it's from inside out. So first it starts with the very specific partial views, and then on top of them, they add kind of these larger portions onto them. Kind of in these places where we either add a reference to the body, so this is the default page navigation placeholder, or a partial view if you're rendering just smaller sections of the UI. So yeah, that is how we get the list. I will not spend time to prettify that, but I think it's a good moment to take a 10-minute break. And after the break, we will focus then on the editing screen. So we can have kind of our input window to save data and so forth. So at 10 minutes past 5, we are continuing. But if you want to take a break now is a good moment, or if you have questions, now is also a good moment for that. Okay, time's almost up. So I think we can slowly get going again. Any questions so far?
Can you please quickly show the view imports?
View. Yeah, so that was view imports CS.html, And it's automatically pre-populated with these, so I haven't been changing.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
But if you were having other folders or other projects in place and wanted to use kind of classes from those in your kind of views, then you would be adding them here.
I'm just trying to understand where is my mistake, because the debugger just says failed and nothing else.
And that's a very mean debugger. Try to look at the error list. So what's showing up there, or do you mean it failed when the page loaded?
Yes. It's
I'd propose maybe let's skip for that for a while, and once kind of we're done with the presentation part, we can return back to that and we can do screen sharing. So then I'll probably be able to help you a bit better.
okay. Thank you.
Okay, but let's proceed. So we got our list of participants. So I'm not going to spend time to make it prettier. That's something for you to do. Do read Bootstrap documentation if you haven't. That is the easier way how to get started. But you can also kind of set up your own challenge if you want to practice CSS and try to style the elements or the tables yourselves and try to get a specific look or feel based on some other web page to use as inspiration. But yeah, for Bootstrap, what I usually do is, well, no one can possibly remember all the styles, at least not if you're not working with them daily. So what I do, I usually have kind of documentation open, and I will look for specific things like, okay, contenting tables. So if I want my table to be pretty, then I look at the sample, what kind of things I need to have set to have it look a bit prettier. So, well, it's class table. That seems pretty easy enough. So I can throw that onto my table. So we'll look at that, what impact it has to look and feel of the table afterwards when I launch my application. But for now, we still don't have anything in the index page. And if you remember our plan, then we wanted to, well, we have the participant list. That's good, but we don't yet have the participant registration screen. So this is a form which I would need to kind of fill in data about the participants so that they are added to the participant list. Okay, so we are in the view for the participants, and let's fill it up with form data. So yeah, let's make it strongly typed. So at model, it will be participant. So that way our form is a bit easier to use. And then if I were kind of really lazy, I could just do something like this. Nope. At editor 4, and that's participant. Nope, not only participant, but I think this was the correct syntaxes. Name. And we basically have 3 fields, so it's name, email, and age. And this is kind of one of the magic things for MVC, is that you can very easily specify that you want editor for a specific property type. And then based on the data type, so in this case it's string, it will try to find the editor template, so the partial view that's responsible for this data type based on kind of this model declarations. So you would have at model string, and then that would be an editor for string data type. And it will look first in kind of this event folders, editor templates, subfolder, or then to shared views and look for the editor templates there. Fortunately for things like default kind of data value types, so string, integer, boolean, no, actually not boolean, so string, integer, it will have inputs generated automatically, so you can get by without creating a specific input. And just for the kind of sake of quickness, let's actually go with this, so I can show later what the alternatives are once we start saving this data. But now to just proceed quicker, let's do it like this. So, and each one of these, well, of course, it's a form. It will ASP action, and action name will be index, and ASP controller will be event. And I'll explain why it's index again. But here we tell the form, so once we submit this form, we want to post data to this specific action in this specific controller. Okay, and input are just button. Type submit. So this is a button that will be submitted. So how do we call it? Add participant, the most unimaginative name for a button. One comment here on the difference between button and input type button value. So these both kind of these notations will create an input control that looks like a button, and you can style it to look whatever you want, but they kind of do the same thing by default. The difference here is that this one triggers submit for the form, and this input type button, we can also it can also be used to submit the form, but as it is an input control within the form, it will also send its value. So in most cases, we don't really want to do that for buttons. So hence, I prefer to use buttons for submit. Okay, then no questions in chat, no questions in chat. Good, let's proceed. So if we have a form, it will kind of enter, you will be able to enter 3 fields and you will be able to click submit, so it posts this form to the server. Now on the server side, in the controller, we had the index view to kind of check, kind of show the form. That's working fine currently. Well, at least should be working fine. We haven't tested yet. Let's have another action called index again, and I'll get in a moment why I prefer to name them the same. But this time, let's add participant. And so let's add participant model of type participant. And the thing is that when we submit the form, it will be submitting all the contents of the form. And what MVC does, it will look at the kind of all these actions which we have in the controller because we've submitted to event controller. And when it sees kind of these two actions, it will try to kind of look for the most fitting one. And we can help it along by saying that this one is for HTTP post requests, and this one is for HTTP GET requests. So when we just enter the URL, the browser will do a GET request, and it will kind of get to this action and return the view. But if we do a post request, we get to this section, it will try to map whatever values are sent from the form from the browser to this model. Well, to this object we called model. And with that, you can do whatever you want to do with that. For example, save it in the database. So now that we have this distinction, let's try to run it. Now let's add some breakpoint here so we can see if we actually get here. I'll do the compile time and launch time like this when I'm streaming, then it's a good time to ask questions. Okay, we got to our My Application. By the way, remind me if I forget, we need, before we launch next time, add a link to the navigation so we can actually get easier rather than typing the URLs. Okay, wow, that's my fancy form. So currently we just were asking for editor for controls. So it did its best to automatically generate something that allows us to enter values. So even added labels for those. So that's something to do still. But let's just try to enter some values. Oh, and you see that for numeric control, it actually added, so the browser understands it's expecting a number value. So we get these small nifty control kind of helpers for numeric values, and we don't get that for string values. But yeah, so if we click submit, hey, we get to the view, and here, if we check, actually, we got the values that we added in the form. So what happened, and let's actually run this through. So this should reload, but this time I will use browser tools to show what is happening. So F12 on my keyboard, and we get to the browser tools. If you're doing front-end development, do read about them, try them out, and learn about them. They are kind of the first go-to when you have any issues, and this is also a way how, for example, when I have been doing kind of very front-end development, also customizing CSS styling to look like something else on the web. Oftentimes I will go and look how they did it and use that kind of for reference and or to kind of as basis for what I'm trying to do. So that's a good way to learn how or to explore what others did and how do they do it. But here under Network tab, if we reload the page, let's see what's happening. So our page loaded. So let me see. No, I cannot zoom it here. And it's not on the settings. Okay, sorry. I hope you can approximately see. So this event request was the main application request. And then after it got the main HTML, HTML said, well, there are still these other things you need to grab. So it grabbed jQuery, Bootstrap, and our own site JavaScript. So, but this was just loading the page. Let's try entering some values again and sending them to the server. So we are on the server on a breakpoint. So the browser is waiting for the server to respond. But let's see what actually happened here. So there was this request. And we can check all kinds of things here, what was happening. So what did we send to the server? And here, I can then very below in the header, so we have form data. So what it did, it sent kind of this key value combinations for name, email, and age. In addition, it added request verification token, but we'll not kind of get into details about that. Currently, it's just kind of used to verify that it's indeed your application that is requesting this action. So, but we'll not touch on that deeper. Maybe if you have a question later on, I can link a deeper explanation for that. So name, email, age, just string key and string value. So nothing fancy is kind of saved when we request form data. And because of this, you have full flexibility to create your own HTML controls, as long as in the end they submit the data in this same format. Because what happens next on the browser side, the URL will get routed to this controller, and then MVC will try to map. So it will look, okay, I'm trying to call this action and it has a parameter, but I probably need to pass, a value to that. And the parameters type is participant, so most likely the form will be sending me something. And what it does, it basically looks at the names there. So currently it's age, email, name, same as in the form, and just map them based on the naming. So this naming is not, if I'm not mistaken, it's not case sensitive. And you can kind of do deeper mapping if you use .notions. So just like what you would use to kind of get deeper into the object. So if you are mapping to more complex objects, that way you can go through ... and kind of get to deeper properties within that object. So this allows you to basically map your form to fairly complex objects underneath, so they don't necessarily need to be fully flat objects. And in fact, kind of this model binding becomes important when you're working with lists, because there every list item has a separate index and in itself is an object which has some properties. So yeah, that's mapping, and currently, well, we are not doing anything with the object, so we return to the view. And yeah, it kind of keeps our values, because on the server side, we already received these values, and these values were in the view state preserved. So yeah, if we would have, well, the more normal application flow, of course, would be that, and now I will stop it, would be that on index, we show the form, then on the submit, we don't actually return the view. What we would do is if model state, and this is an object, well, property of the controller, which is responsible for storing all the data related to model binding. And for model state, we can ask is valid. We'll add some validations in a moment, but so if the model state is valid, so if the model corresponded to all the validation checks, then we can save, of course, and return would be not view. Redirect to action. So we want the browser to say, okay, you're done with this page. Now please go to this different URL, because actually we want to, we want to go to the action that's called participants, and that's a string value. So let's close this. On your question about not knowing how to code. Yeah, not knowing how to code will be difficult, because kind of the course itself is built on self-study, and we are starting from kind of this basis that you have some development experience, at least on this kind of can follow along with the tutorials that are available. But for kind of the very basic programming knowledge, yeah, you'll have difficulty kind of following along with the steps on your own. So you can reach out in Discord. We can link you some of the materials we have specifically for basics. But yeah, sorry, but probably we needed to communicate a bit clearer than the base expectations. Okay, so, but yeah, reach out on Discord about the basics, because we do have some of the materials we use for reskilling, which we could share with you. Why are 2 redirect actions? Well, that's a very good question. I shouldn't have 2 redirect actions. That happens when I try to. Here, and that even doesn't complain anymore. So thank you. Okay, so this path should take us to this action. And if the model is not valid, then we just return back to the same view, but the model state will already be updated that, hey, this model is not valid. Now let's try to make this poor form a little bit more readable. So it was event index. So, and yeah, for that actually, I will try to use Bootstrap's suggestions. So let's see what's the sample for input. Form overview. That looks like an example form. Okay. Now copy pasting. And as you see, I'm copy pasting codes sometimes from sources which some would say is not a good practice. Copy paste is the source of evil, because if you copy paste code which you don't understand and it kind of works, means you just kind of think it works. And at some point it will come back to bite you, because it will stop working on in certain situations. So I'm doing a bit of shortcuts to speed up things. But in general, once you feel familiar with the technologies you're using, and if you understand what you're copying, or kind of feel comfortable that you'll be able to edit it enough to kind of take ownership of that code you copied, at that point, copy paste becomes a good tool, but well, you still will regret at some moments that you copy pasted something. So what did I copy? So it's a sample of the form, and what the Bootstrap does for each of the elements, so it puts it in its own div. So let's not kind of do blind copy paste. Let's at least follow the minimal suggestions that, well, they gave us. So every element in its own form, and that, oh no, the button is actually not in its own div. Okay, let's not give its own div. So that's a div, and that's a div, and I think I closed everything. Okay. So that's that, and yeah, looks okay. Now, label 4. So now this is something which would be useful, so we understand what it's actually. So let's try something like this. Actually, let's copy this. So we know that this will be input type text with name, incidentally called name. So we can use that and just type it here. So this should still work like a label. So when you click on the label, it will navigate to the associated input field. And that should work, and that should work, except it's not name, it's email, and it's not age, it's age. Okay, so that's added. form text. So we will not have any suggestions for validation. HTML.validation for, yeah. So this is a nifty helper because it shows the validation message for specific field, same like we did with editor 4. And this is useful because it means we can just tag on the validation, and whatever the validation message will be, it's already then displaying correct one. Just need to align it with the correct fields here. And we are missing some classes for our submit button. There we go. No longer need that. So this looks manageable, understandable, and well, I feel okay with trying to use this. Okay. We just need validations for the form fields, right? So let's start with simple ones. So name should be required. Now it doesn't understand it yet because I'm not having the I don't have the right using yet. And the library responsible for this is system.componentModel.data annotations. And kind of through these attributes, we can add different validation requirements on top. There are additional libraries out there which you can use to kind of set up validation in different ways. This will be the one that I'm showing today and using today, just because it's the simplest one to set up. But Fluent Validate would be something to look into how it's used, and I'm not sure which one was used in the labs. So there, I think, was a separate section in the lab specifically for the validation. You can read through that as well. So max length, let's say our name would be 100 characters. It's a bit limiting. Well, let's say 200. Nobody should feel discriminated. Same for email, and here I would actually kind of go and spend some time to read and understand what is the maximum allowed length for email. Because what I know, if we have manual testers in the project, they will definitely find the maximal length for email and try with that value and complain that doesn't work. And the same actually is for business. You never know what your users are. Okay. Required. Age will not be required, but we want to maybe limit. So actually don't remember what the naming was for that. So let's Google that. So how to Google ASP.NET, because that's the framework I'm using. Then MVC, because that's the specific application type we're trying to write. And validation number range. And thankfully somebody wrote about it. Or I could just go to Microsoft Docs, so that's equally as helpful. Sometimes more helpful because people write articles in different times, and the articles may refer to different versions of ASP.NET. So that's something to look out for. But let's see. So range, yes, that's indeed something that can be used, except for our age, the range will be slightly different. So if he's living past 150, I'm calling him out on that. And as for every of these kind of validation attributes, you can edit the error message. And this is the way how you would customize it in your application to kind of have it more user-friendly. Okay. That's it. And let's make a leap of faith. Just a quick check. This should work. Let's try it out. While it builds and loads, any questions?
I've noticed that. You already talked about that fluent messages. That means like validation at client side.
No, client-side validation is a bit different. So for client-side, you will need JavaScript enabled to actually can support the client-side validation. This one will happen purely on server side. But the reason why I'm showing this first is you can never trust what's happening on the browser because it's, well, in the hands of the user, so to say. So if I was wanting to cheat, I could kind of change anything that happens on the browser, or I could just pretend to be a browser with my custom application that submits anything I want to submit. So when building app, you always need to have the server-side validation. Client-side validation, it's enabled by adding a JavaScript, or maybe in the newer versions, it's already automatically included. We'll see in a moment. And nobody reminded me that I need to update the navigation links. Oh well, we'll go brute force way. So my form looks a bit better now. It does have the labels. It doesn't look quite all right yet, at least not how in the samples of Bootstrap, because I probably am missing some of the wrapping styles. So we'll look at it a bit later, but at least it's more readable now, and the button certainly looks much better. So let's try submit it. Okay, so client-side validation is not working currently. We'll add it in a moment. But what happened? So we went to the server. We didn't go to redirect to action because model state is valid equals false. So the validation detected what was happening, and in model state, it actually adds under values, it adds a list with field keys and specific validation errors. So basically, if there are multiple validations, it could aggregate the different validation errors. But we'll see how it looks like once it gets back to the server, to the browser. So here are the validation messages. So this is required, and value none is not valid value because we have the range validator. Not actually the range, it's 0 would kind of -1 would trigger the range validator. So what we got is type validator. So we're trying to submit empty string, which is not a valid numeric value. Yeah, and then if we actually supply some more valid data, and notice that the email is, well, not really an email at this point, then it actually said valid false. Now I'm curious. Of course, 100 is more believable age. And we get redirected, so we hit this one, and we ended up in our page with the listing. Now, as we have spent more than an hour and a half now on this live coding session, I want to pause for a moment because we are still have planned to kind of have some Q&A time, especially because you might have some questions about the next task you have to do or try to do for the next event. That is in a week and not in 2 weeks like it was this time. So next Thursday. So my proposal would be that we set aside some time for questions you might have. And if there are no questions, then we could kind of return back to the live coding. My own aim is that I will continue this app even if we stop the meeting. And later today, I will kind of upload it to GitHub at a state where you could basically, we already touched on the next part. So here you have a list of participants that you should be loading from a database. And here is the place where you should be saving additional participants to the database. So that would be the state at which I leave you, but I would want to kind of make it feel more complete. So when you start, then it's a bit more fleshed out. Okay, but yeah, any questions so far? Either about the topics that we went through or about the task that's for the next event. Can we use regex? Yes, absolutely. So for that, I will use documentation again, because it's so validation and regex. And we even have Stack Overflow samples. So, but let's actually go. Yeah, so for next task, I'll return to presentation in a moment. So for regex, first name, last name. So yeah, these could be used as samples, but basically you would add them as any other validation attribute. You just need to write your own regex right here. And that's the challenging part for it. For email especially, it's kind of interesting thing to Google around how to correctly validate email. And what you'll get basically is that the effort you could spend to try to kind of get it very specific doesn't guarantee you anything, because the email might not even exist. So unless your customer has sent an email to you from that email, you have no guarantees that the email exists. So maybe it's not even worth to spend that much time validating it. Although some simple validation that at least the dots are there help with situations where people mistyped their email. Although if they are mistyping things, that they might as well get their own email address wrong. So for next task, switch back to the presentation and to this slide. So yeah, so next week our topic is entity framework and working with database. So if for now we have kind of static list of participants and kind of nothing else, next time the idea would be that we would add database to store those participants in the long term, and logic to retrieve and store that data in the database. So to do some operations with data. So what you need to do is set up the database itself. So Microsoft SQL database is the preferred option. If you want to go with something else, it's up to you. I could try to support you, but on the other hand, it's good enough exercise in itself. Entity framework, core, or another ORM has to be used. And ORM, that's object relation mapping. That's kind of a framework that helps you to ask objects from database instead of kind of listing the fields in the table. But for that, we already have kind of the materials available for you to read in the next under the next topics in GitHub folders. So you will need to be able to run your app still locally. We'll be deploying it somewhere only later. And you need to store both code and your database structure in the source repository. So you can start from the app that I will upload today, or you can start from one of the labs that are already on GitHub, or if you kind of have built your own app so far, please do continue with that. That's usually more fun, and you'll feel more at home with your own code rather than with some lab where you might not understand why there are different sections. I hope that answers. Any other questions?
When will this video be uploaded? Like right now or tomorrow?
Well, Sandis probably will send me its recording after it finishes. So either late tonight or then tomorrow. I would mostly look as tomorrow as my commitment, but I'll try to do it tonight.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, same thing that new to that thing. So now you are live coding, and we are follow it and trying. It's possible, doable right now. If we add entity framework, what we will do in next session?
Yeah, next
will
session.
you do the same thing that adding entity framework and setting it, or?
Yes. So the idea is that I go through the same exercise, maybe smaller, but you can get the chance to ask questions or follow-ups if something was unclear for you related to what I'm doing on what you tried on your own, and you can kind of have already some more substantial questions, because if you would just kind of follow along, the most questions you would get is only what you are seeing on the screen. So in a guided exercise, you will encounter less issues. When you go on your own, you'll likely encounter more issues, but it will give you more opportunities to have questions and work with the code itself. So yeah, next time I'll be showing how to add entity framework on this very own app. And after that, the next session, we had adding dependency injection. Well, we'll talk specifically about dependency injection and unit testing. So those will be the next topics after that. Did it clarify it, or is there still questions about this?
Clear.
Okay. If you started to use .NET Core 5, that's totally okay. I don't think you'll face too many kind of difficulties there. The views might be different. I'm not. Yeah, I won't be able to immediately comment what the specific differences that you might encounter, but I think you'll be fine. Okay. Anything else?
The questions will start when we start doing something.
Well, that's what I was worried that in Discord I didn't get too many questions. I kind of had the feeling that people are not doing things. But yeah, this kind of the way how we have structured the event, it is more about what you do. If we would have this in the classroom setting, then I would be more comfortable with doing kind of everyone coding along with the presenter. At that point, it's easier to kind of stop and support and kind of manage the time with that. But in this remote setting, especially, well, we all feel tired after sitting for longer times. So we need to kind of make the presentation more condensed and then give you time on your own terms to kind of proceed and follow. Yeah, but Levi, did you resolve the issue you had with your kind of application that it kind of didn't want to run?
No, it's not recognizing my how do I say it, input fields. Like for the instance, the name item does not exist in the current context. It's
Okay.
I probably
yeah for
missed
that
something.
For that, I would suggest that once we are done with the event, let's stop at that point and you can share your screen and we can specifically at your code.
Unfortunately, I need to jump to the next next lesson.
Yeah,
and
reach out to me in Discord later on. Try to do the same.
I will try.
you have time and we can try to arrange when it's possible.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else for the Q&A? Because my proposal would be, if we don't have any more active comments, is that I could proceed with the implementation, or at least for half an hour, and we could tackle a bit more of the front-end topics, or maybe if there's specific wish from any of you, which area should be covered. I know that there was request to add this Blazor part. At least Janis was curious about that. So we could try to also look at that part. Alternatively, then I'll kind of talk about how we can split code in when we organize it, and the reasoning why we don't want to keep everything in one project itself. Opinions? Agreed, it is an opinion, but to which? Okay. Anyone else? Or everyone agreeing with the agreed? Okay. I'll take it as a yes. All right, so let's continue with live coding, and let's do half an hour, and after that I can still take questions, or if everyone kind of wants to get on with their evening, then we can stop at that point. But of course, if you have to rush, that's understandable, and as I'm taking longer than initially anticipated, then it's fine if you have to drop earlier. The recording will be up. Okay. So what we added was validation, so that was working. Maybe not looking as pretty as I intended, but that's something we could get to if we spent a bit more time with the Bootstrap documentation. Yeah, before we add additional functionality, I will touch a little bit on the structure itself, because currently we've been just adding the different classes and the logic within the classes just kind of inside the existing structure. So there was some logic within the controller, adding was just a comment, so all in one bunch. And the risk as the application grows, at some point, well, usually my metric is that once one method starts to take more than half of a screen, you need to start to think about if you are structuring your code enough. And at this point, structuring would kind of depend on what you're building. What else are you building? So we understand that we will have our front end, and that's kind of separate thing. We will have our database, and that it's its own separate thing. But then for kind of creating of events and adding participants to events, I would argue that there is possibility that later we might get some business logics like ordering tickets, how to handle when we add a new participant, send out the emails required for that. So that could be some business use cases that are added on top of kind of what we're building. And if everything of that would be located here when we do saving, then this kind of part would grow and kind of become rather large mess, especially if you add connections to database here and start to do more and more logic within just one method. So one of the approaches how well I've seen that we do structuring in our projects, and well, also some other people follow the similar approach, is that we start to split the logic in different projects, not only in one project. And it enables you later, especially if it's intended to be a larger application, to structure code in a way where you can reuse it easier from different parts of the program. And especially nowadays when we have services which are used not only, well, you not only have a web page, but for example, you might have also a mobile app working in tandem with the web page. So in those situations, the ticket reservation part will be the same. Well, why would you write it both in the mobile app and create separate backend logic for that, and then have it separately for your web app? That's just asking for trouble and miscommunication somewhere. So what you want is to move business logic away from your presentation logic. And the way how it, well, one of the ways is just create additional folders here in the project. But the other way is to create separate projects. And another way, which would be more overkill, would be to create entirely different services. But we'll not go into microservice territory because that's a whole other more difficult topic. So yeah, under this, so let's add new project. And that would be a class library. So class library in itself is just a collection of different classes, which can be loaded by any other application. And seeing that Oyars is leaving us. Hey, thank you for joining. Okay, so class library, we want to use C#. Yeah, I'm not sure why do I have F# installed, must be a default. So, and let's name it super event service. Currently just a library, but I want to store all the kind of business logic services in there. So hence I named it service. So language framework version, this one is fine. And we have another project, which, well, has a default class in it. What I want to do is to add, well, a service. Well, as in a service, what I mean is usually it's a class which has methods that describe different service operations for the specific domain object. So in our case, the domain object would be event itself or the participant, and then this service would allow kind of to do operations related to this domain object. And this way, our front-end logic doesn't really interact with the database directly. It interacts with this domain, with this service, which represents specific operations which you can do with the domain object. So super event service, and the class will be event service or event logic. Kind of depends on what kind of naming you prefer. I think in the labs we were using service naming. Well, just to mix it up, I will use logic here. Not always the best. There are some arguments that it's bad practice to name things logic, but on the other hand, it's to everyone it's clear that under event logic you will find business logic related to events. Seem to make sense to me, but once you're actually working the projects, it's usually more than just you making those decisions. So you might come up with a different solution that fits best. And for this, we would probably have public. I'm now thinking, do I want it to be event logic or participant logic? What would make more sense for you? Are we doing operations with events or are we doing operations with participants? Participants. I kind of start to get the same feeling once I start to think about method names. And that's the thing with naming. Some say naming is the hardest thing to do in software development. And sometimes you'll kind of start working with one set of naming and later along the way you realize, well, this doesn't really fit. So, and it's, I think, good practice to return and rename things so that they are clear and understandable, not only to you, but also to others who could be using this. So participant logic. And I also want to rename this one. Okay. So public add participant. So we would want to add a participant. But, well, we don't have it. So where is our view model? It's under our front-end application under models. Okay, this could work, but the problem is that it's a different project and we already want our front-end project to depend on the service. So we would want to call the service from the front end. So models usually, especially kind of models that are used to communicate between different parts of the application, they end up in a different project usually. That's kind of referenced by everyone else. Well, by all the different projects that we have. So I will add another project and it will be another class library. This is super event models. And super event models could be very similar to the classes that we have. So if we have the participant there, then why wouldn't this be participant? Okay. And the fields it has, those would be very similar to what this participant has. So it would have name, it would have email, it would have age. But this is the object which most likely will get stored also in database later on. So for this, we might have additional fields which are ID. Which we don't really want to use in our other participant model, because for front-end, we have never needed an ID. So maybe it's not even required here. And certainly when users submit the form, we don't want to add, for them to add additional value to the form fields called ID, and it would get mapped down the line to the object. So they could suddenly pick and choose their ID in the database, which is not really what we want to have. So yeah, participant. And once we have to start to have kind of this more wider structure, then kind of this error view model naming with the suffix view model starts to make sense, because we want to differentiate which models do we want to use in kind of our core logic and which are used only for the front end for the presentation purposes. So in this case, I would then do a rename to and it asks, do I want to do the renaming for everything else? And I do. So let's check. So under views, we had in the participant list, hey, it's renamed. So thanks, Visual Studio, you're awesome. So now it's easier for me to distinguish when I'm dealing with participant and with the view model or the service model. One of the things to remember is that it's not necessary. We could have kept identical names, but in those cases, we have to be very careful with the namespace usage. And those classes that use both, in those we need to use the namespace prefix to correctly reference which participant model are we referencing. But now what we need to do is to add references for the project so that super event service knows about our super event models. And under dependencies, add project reference. So we want to know about that. And our super event app, we want to know it about both other projects. So both about models and about super event reference. And now it knows about that. So when we look here, we need to add the correct using from super event models. And this logic could actually now be written. So this would be save to database. And the other one be public list participant. And now actually what I had in my event controller, a better place for it to live would be the service, because that would deal with connecting to database and if need to be filtering from the event list or organizing that. So my front end is a bit, well, dumber, and instead can these services or logic classes become the ones that do the smart things. The thing I need to correct is usings again. Systems collection generic for the list. And I actually need to return this. Okay, looks like we didn't lose any of Johnny's in the process. But our age is different. Why is our age different? Because I copied it, of course. And nobody of you objected. Okay. Now we have our super event service, and it can do two things: add participant and get event participants. And one thing as a hint for the future, this is something we will touch on when we will talk about testing and dependency injection, because that kind of topic will cover mostly what kind of rules we usually follow to make our projects more maintainable. And kind of dependency injection is one of the cornerstones there. It's actually already showcased how it works in the auto-generated home controller, but I will currently not touch on that, and on purpose I will kind of implement it first using, well, bad practices, so creating new instances of services. So we can later on come back and fix it. Okay, so participants logic, but one thing I will kind of suggest to you to do already from the beginning is to extract interfaces. Okay, extract interface, participant logic. Here we go. So we have both, and the interface just describes the different methods that we do. And that will become important once we talk about dependency injection. But for now, not to forget, I just did that. Okay, but in our event controller, now we could just do okay, this needs using. Participant logic, get event participants. This would be awesome. So the goal is to have the controller mostly worry about controlling applications flow. So go there, do that, take this object, pass it to view, kind of operating in this manner. That way you don't have too much logic in here and it's easier to see what's happening. But this code looks like it will compile and it will work, except there's a problem. So currently we are returning a list of super event model participants, and we are passing it to view that expects a list of participant view models. And it means we actually cannot do this immediately because that's a different view model we want to kind of pass on to front end. And we need to do some mapping. So and for that, let's create a list where to store it. And participants list. So we go through the list, iterate, and each of the models we get. Here we add new. And this is the tedious part. Item H. Email is item email. By the way, is this clear why we are doing this? Okay. So this should work. What else did we break? Janis, by somewhere else, do you mean it somehow differently do the mapping?
I mean, no, it's look at clear, more clear when you extract, and now we messing it up again.
Yes, you're right. And the thing is that we need to find a balance, and where the balance lies will be very subjective in a way, because from one side, hey, the mapping happens right before we show it. So that's kind of logical place, even if it looks a bit messy. It could be extracted to different files, and that will be next thing. I will extract it to mappers. Well, let's call them mappers. There is no real convention how to do that, but in the labs you have AutoMapper. So that's a framework which kind of helps to make cleaner this kind of mapping from one object to other. It's very useful when you need to map kind of these very similar objects one to another. It has some downsides because if the objects kind of change over time, you might not notice that it's no longer mapping. So you rename the property on one side and suddenly it's no longer kind of mapping cleanly just because one side was renamed slightly. So AutoMapper helps, but it kind of can hide some of the issues for mapping. On the other hand, you can also go very in a manual way, but well, given the feedback that we've gotten in our own project from people, it can feel very tedious to add the kind of manual mappings. And also it's, well, more code to write because, well, this took some time for me to do. And if the object is larger, it's more things to add. But let's try to clean it up. And after that, we can kind of do the next thing and replace it with the AutoMapper. So yeah, to clean it up, what would be useful? To have just a class which is responsible for mapping to and kind of in one direction and in the other direction, because we haven't yet used save, but here also we would need to create an instance of the logic. And here we would also need to map to the different model type. So yeah, let's add mappers. And if you are following along, do not follow this part because I will be removing them in a couple of minutes again. And item, and so mappers are just a concept. There is no special kind of file type for that or naming for that. It's just an idea that we have classes for mapping specific objects. So it's participant mapper. And this could actually be static because we don't want to store anything. So it would have static model map. And this one also needs a using. Let's not use reserved names for naming properties. And one might argue that we are not actually solving anything in terms of the kind of ugliness or complexity of the code. We're just pushing it to a less visible place. So it might make us feel better, but the complexity is in a way unavoidable. So okay, is something. So this needs using. As it's a static class, we can just highlight it like this. Oh, it's actually for the wrong place, sorry. I haven't written that yet. So this replaces this one. And this is potentially a bit cleaner. And we could kind of probably get a one-liner if we used link use statement for this. Convert to link you. Now let's try it for the giggles. Okay. In the projects I've been part of, I usually discourage people from doing this because for me, this feels kind of less like structured code, but it's a personal thing and it is valid code, it compiles, and some people might even prefer this as a well, it takes less space compared to what we had previously. So the for each might look messier for someone. But both notions work. And then for this second way around, we would actually need to do another map. But in this case, we're mapping from this one to this one. So the other way around. Funny thing is, as long as the objects are identical, it's actually, as you see, quite simple to create the other mapping. Okay. mapper, maps, and here we have model. Okay, that one looks much cleaner than the list handling here. But as I said, we are still just hiding the additional work that we did. So other part would be to use AutoMapper, and I think I can try to go on my own without the guidance. Let's see how disastrous that turns out to be. So for that, we will need NuGet package. So that's not standard, part of the standard ASP.NET. So we need to add a NuGet package to actually get that functionality. So that's third-party library.
That one is to stay?
Sorry. So this
this one is what will be in the project.
Yes, this one I leave. So as I mentioned, AutoMapper can be very useful because we don't need to do the mapping classes, but sometimes I find it a bit dangerous because once you do renaming, you don't always see what the impact was. So it might no longer map correctly just because you renamed one side of the object. And for kind of very large and long-term projects, it might become enough of a concern that in the project that I work in, we have banned the use of AutoMapper. Well, we might reconsider it at some point, but so far, kind of the issues that we got from it were a bit too much for us to agree using that. But that's for a project where we have approximately 100 people working on a source code that was built over more than 10 years of time. So every situation will have different decisions. So there's never a clear, this one is a bad approach, this one is a good approach. Okay, so click install. So NuGet warns us what it will be installing, what other dependencies. For this one, as I know it, and I understand it's licensing, so it's MIT, so safe enough. But if you're kind of working on something and are using libraries, do be careful with the naming of them and kind of installing the correct library. Especially with if you're working with JavaScript and their NPM packaging, that is a kind of known place which is used to target people who are depending on external libraries. So sometimes even just kind of taking a name that's very similar or common misspelling to get a different library than you intended in your source code. Okay, so now it installed. Now I have it here under package references. And what I can actually do, but first I would probably need to read up on syntaxes for it. Has been a while since I've used it personally. So we installed getting started guide. Well, that sounds something that I need. Okay. Configuration should happen only once. Application startup global success. Okay, so in the very top. So for this, I actually would need to check how it's implemented. So it means I won't be doing it live. But yeah, the actual implementation. So I will do this before uploading it to source control, but configuration is that we say that we need to create a map and we specify between which two objects. And if you don't have any special rules, that's basically it. So it's only one line. After that, to call it, you would just kind of ask it to do mapper, map, and specify. So what you skip from our implementation would be creation of, creation of this specific class. Yeah, thank you, Andra. You're free to go. And the implementation for the AutoMapper will be in the final source code, but I probably will not be implementing it until the end here, just because I don't have the configuration set up, so you don't need to suffer through me. setting it up. So yeah, it would replace this part of the code, and that, well, that's still quite a lot of lines, and with larger objects you can imagine it becomes even more tedious to set up these mappers. And then in the code you would just, oops, sorry, wrong controller. You would have it called here, just like we did with our own custom mappers. So yeah, but sorry, I will not proceed because I should read up how to set it up correctly. The thing is that while you could do the setup inline, the automapper setup needs to happen only once. They kind of highlight it very specifically. And the reason for this is otherwise, well, the configuration itself is a singleton in the end. So if you start setting it up in multiple places, your application may be running on different threads, so your other users are requesting data. And that if you're at the same time doing this configuration, you're blocking those threads because this singleton is being updated. So that is the difficulty with automapper, and yeah, in the labs it's already set up, but I will kind of go through this and set it up myself before I check it in, but I will not showcase it currently. Yeah, but in the end, we have a service which can do the kind of more logic operations with what we have in place. So this would be replaced with the call to database, and with the participant list, we could probably order by name, for example. So yeah, there you could add more business logic, and it's not in the controllers. The downside of kind of creating more structure is that in the controllers, you have to have some logic then to call the right things and to do mapping. Actually, for the mapping, there is also one different approach where people, instead of separate mapper classes, people add the mapping methods here to the object itself, to the model, its view model itself. And from my perspective, that's just kind of different place where to hide it. The amount of work kind of stays the same, but it's a bit different than how it's written in here. So instead of having the static class reference, it would be just calling item to that model. Okay, bit different way how to approach it. Okay. Any questions, any comments, or maybe any special wishes before we wrap up? Well, that's why we are, yeah, lots of information. So that's the reason why we are doing recordings. So you get the chance to then rewatch and recheck. Okay, then before we wrap up, I will highlight let's go to our GitHub page. And I wanted to highlight one of the labs for the Blazor sample. As I didn't have time to go through that, I just want to highlight some of them. Here under the second topic, under the lab sources, I think it was lab 14. So this one focuses on adding a Blazor component on top of the MVC application. Now, this is not quite a normal use case. Normally, you would pick either or, so either it would be an MVC application or it would be a Blazor application. But what it does, it showcases how the Blazor components look like. So those can look the same regardless of where they're hosted. And it showcases, it gives you something where you can play around with how it operates. And the advantage of Blazor is that while in our sample, when our registration form is kind of reloaded and kind of At that point, we do a full page reload. So we send request to server, get back a full set of HTML, and reload that. If you're building a single page application using JavaScript, Vue.js, React, or Blazor, the advantage is that you can send only a small part for the web page to be reloaded. So instead of the whole frame, you can just kind of take your specific table, ask for the server to give you a specific page or filtered list from that table, and server will pre-render only that part and send it back. And with Blazor, the nice thing about it is that it's hiding the complexity of JavaScript. It is, of course, its own complexity, because while the syntax is the same of C# and Razor, the nuances currently kind of make some of the things a bit challenging to do. So it's still a very new thing. And if you kind of want to try it, I would recommend that you look at it in combination with already a preset of ready-made controls. So Telerik, there's a reason why Telerik has been kind of going together with Microsoft in the recent announcements about news about Blazor, because it's easier to use it if you already have a set of controls and don't need to build your own. But I couldn't name now currently any open source or kind of ready-made control packs that you could just pick up. But those do exist. I just don't have a list ready for that. Yeah, so this is the lab you can look at, comparing it to the lab 13 to look at what were the specific things that were added to make Blazor work. Yes, as you were mentioning Blazor specifically, did you have any questions, or maybe was there something more specific that you wanted to try or to ask?
No, if we are using MVC,
Mm-hmm.
Razor, then okay.
Yeah, for actually for this, let me save my changes so I can finish this up a bit later. And let's open a new instance of Visual Studio.
Basically, it looked like same.
It looks very. It's still built on ASP.NET, but the execution is different. Like I explained, it does things on the server, but then it can execute some of the code on the client side as well. Let's actually try to create a new project. I mean, something will probably go wrong, but let's go for it. That assuming if I have the Blazor template installed. Now I'm thinking. No, I'm thinking that I probably don't. Oh no, I actually have it. Yeah, so for Blazor, there are two templates. So one is WebAssembly app. So this means that you create a Blazor app, and that app will operate and live in the browser mostly, and communicate with the server side with some API on the backend, but mostly will be executed within the browser. And the way that it does is it's kind of compiles the app into WebAssembly, and browsers nowadays can execute that code like they execute JavaScript. Blazor server app is similar, but it's most of its computation and rendering of the page components happens on server side instead of the browser. And it only fetches those parts of the web page which it needs to refresh from the server when those are being updated or need to be updated. So that's still pretty quick, just because it's underneath that using SignalR, which basically creates an open connection between the browser and the server and keeps it open. So it doesn't need to reestablish connection on every request like our MVC application, where every request to the server is a new connection which we open to kind of make communication. But then when we actually go and create, I think the kind of Razor templates, like we were looking at the view pages in MVC, those look very similar, except now they have this add code part, where you can describe more of operations that can happen. Okay, that should be added. Just for sake of experimentation, let's create a new solution for this.
For this one, I am interested in where is the controllers, because at server I didn't find ones.
Yeah, you don't really have controllers. So you have pages. So models are models, shared things are shared things. Now, let's start with the index. So the page is index and it would load kind of these HTML controls. In addition, it has code, and this one would be executed on the server side. Well, could be executed on the server side. So, or oh no, actually, this I think could execute on the client side by itself. So increment counter, it could just go ahead. Fetch data, where you interact with another service, kind of only has this code section, and that is what executes. So the page loads, it does all the computations required, and you work with that code. So there is no posting back to server. When you need to reach out to server, you basically need to do that through the services. And in this case, this weather forecast service is the backend. You could think of the service as the controller, but there is no longer the strict naming convention that this is the model, this is the controller, this is the view. So it's just a service, and just like we had our business logic in it, we could be calling that the only kind of thing that we need to keep in mind with Blazor implementation is that once it calls the services, it prefers them to be asynchronous. So instead of just returning the array of data, it returns a task, so it's an asynchronous request. Does that answer your question about the controllers? So in fact,
Kinda.
fetch data lives on the browser side. This is the code it executes to get data, but somewhere here in between, there is the bridge between client and server. So this code living on the browser will execute a request to the server to call this service. And from there on, it's kind of everything on the server side. So from my own personal perspective, it's a bit of magic until you get used to that. And when there is magic involved in software, it's usually scary and cause for confusion. So for Blazor, if you start, I would recommend to kind of start from the very simple items which are added here, and kind of go through the tutorials that are published by Microsoft to just kind of build up things following along. That way, kind of step by step, it's clearer rather than what we did in the lab where we just add a bunch of basically one page for searching and kind of displaying search results on top of the MVC application. So this might be more confusing. So instead of, probably it would be better to go through these introduction tutorials, which are hosted on Microsoft Docs. So these might be a better choice then. Okay. Anything else to ask, to comment? Because we are in our last 15 minutes, and if there are questions, I would want to answer those. And if there are no questions, and if there is a lot to write about, to think about, then I guess we can call it a day. Yes, no, maybe. All right, I'll take it as a yes. Thank you everyone who joined. And I hope this was interesting for you and I haven't scared you off from the program. In any case, keep touch in Discord. I do encourage asking questions, and you need to try these things out yourself. That way you benefit most. But yeah, thank you.